Okay, let's unpack this. When you picture an army, you probably think structure, ranks, a clear chain of command.
Hmm.
Now, picture anarchism. Usually, that brings to mind anti-state, anti-hierarchy. So the idea of an anarchist army seems like a total contradiction.
It really does.
Yet, that's exactly what emerged from the chaos of the Ukrainian Civil War.
Yeah.
The Revolutionary Insurgent Army of Ukraine, known to history often as the Makhnovist China, named for its most prominent leader, Nestor Makhno.
And surviving in that brutal conflict wasn't just about holding ground or winning battles. It demanded a hidden layer, a clandestine world of intelligence, counterintelligence, and security.
Right.
This deep dive takes us into a perhaps unexpected corner of this unique movement, its intelligence and counterintelligence division, the Kontrrazvedka.
We've been poring over a fascinating collection of sources that really pull back the curtain on this little-known agency.
Yeah, they're quite revealing.
Our mission today is to understand the Kontrrazvedka's origins, how it transformed through the shifting fortunes of the Makhnovist struggle, examine its methods which, the sources reveal, ranged from clever spying to genuinely brutal executions, and explore just how vital and controversial its role was in keeping the Makhnovist China alive.
To understand the Kontrrazvedka, we have to rewind even before the Civil War, back to the early 20th century, and the actions of Ukrainian anarchists under the Russian Empire.
Okay.
They were engaged in a militant campaign, which often involved what they termed expropriations.
Which sounds like a polite word for robbery.
It certainly involves seizing property and funds, yeah. But the sources highlight a crucial distinction. These weren't carried out for personal enrichment. The money and resources taken from state institutions or wealthy capitalists were used almost entirely for publishing anarchist propaganda leaflets, newspapers, spreading their ideas.
So robbing banks to print pamphlets, that's a unique twist on revolutionary finance.
Exactly. And these actions weren't isolated incidents. They escalated dramatically, particularly during the 1905 revolution and the years leading up to 1917.
Wow.
We're talking about thousands of attacks, resulting in thousands of imperial officials killed or wounded.
That level of targeted action must have required significant planning and knowledge. You can't just randomly assault officials or rob trains.
Precisely. This campaign fostered a kind of informal intelligence gathering. Militant anarchist groups had to conduct reconnaissance, research targets, understand patrol routes. They were developing ad hoc intelligence capabilities just to plan their expropriations and attacks effectively.
So it was born out of necessity.
It really was. The seed of a security apparatus, born out of necessity for survival in action.
And the sources point to specific examples of this pre-1917 intelligence work.
They do.
Yeah.
The Union of Poor Peasants in the Katerinoslav province, a group active before the 1917 revolution, actually developed its own intelligence operations specifically to track and target a local police officer for assassination. This tells us that by the time the revolution broke out, there were already individuals among the future insurgents with practical, albeit underground, experience in intelligence and counterintelligence.
And one of those individuals who bridges that pre-revolutionary world with the Makhnovist China is Lev Zadov.
Lev Zadov is a key figure in the Kontrrazvedka story from beginning to end. He had that background imprisoned by the imperial police for criminal activities released during the February Revolution.
Oh, okay.
He initially fought with Red Guards against the White Movement before eventually joining Nestor Makhno's forces. His experience was in the criminal underworld, yes, but also in operating outside the law, skills that would become, well, relevant.
So it wasn't just a spontaneous peasant uprising. There were experienced clandestine operators involved from the start.
Right. And that experience became vital when the Makhnovists needed to build a more formal security structure.
Which brings us to the first actual formation of the Kontrrazvedka. This happens in a really specific political context, doesn't it?
It does. In February 1919, the Makhnovists formed a tactical alliance with the Red Army, integrating into Pavel Dybenko's division, primarily to secure much-needed weapons and supplies.
Right, for the armaments.
Exactly. Following the capture of the city of Berdyansk in March 1919, Maxim Cheredniak was tasked with establishing a counterintelligence division there.
And Cheredniak himself had experience with Bolshevik counterintelligence.
He did. He'd previously organized a counterintelligence detachment for the Red Army's Southern Front. So he brought that more structured, albeit state-influenced, approach to the nascent Makhnovist agency.
What were the first jobs for this new Berdyansk Kontrrazvedka?
According to the sources, their initial tasks were twofold: carrying out requisitions to supply the insurgent brigade, essentially finding resources and hunting down collaborators of the white movement within the city.
Logistics and security right away.
Immediately, yes. They were involved in both.
And they also established a civilian section.
Yes, in Mariupol. This mirrored the military unit's function, in that it was also tasked with procuring provisions, again through methods like expropriation or levying the local population.
Okay.
This became increasingly critical because even early in the alliance, the Red Army Command began cutting supplies to the Makhnovists, forcing them to rely more heavily on their own methods for survival.
Who were the initial members of this first Kontrrazvedka?
It was a mix of people. Chernyak brought in associates like Lev Zadov.
Uh-huh.
There were former members of that Union of Poor Peasants group, Alexander Lepetchenko, Isidor Liudi, Hirihori Vasilevsky, bringing their underground experience.
Right, the ones who targeted the police officer.
Exactly. And there were also veteran specialists from other backgrounds, like Yakov Glazgon, K. Kovalevich, and P. Sobolev. It was a diverse group pooling different kinds of experience.
It didn't take long for conflict to erupt, not with the whites, but with their supposed allies, the Bolsheviks.
That's a crucial moment the sources highlight. Within weeks, the Berdyansk Kontrrazvedka clashed directly with the local Cheka division, the Bolshevik secret police.
Right.
The Kontrrazvedka uncovered what they believed was a Bolshevik plot specifically aimed at assassinating Nestor Makhno.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and tells us something fundamental about the alliance. The Anarchist secret police unit uncovers a plot against their leader by the communist secret police unit they're allied with.
Exactly. This wasn't just a minor disagreement. It was a clash rooted in deep mistrust and competing goals.
I'll say.
The sources say that in response to uncovering the plot, and coupled with the Cheka's broader political repression in the area, Makhno ordered Chernak's Kontrrazvedka to forcibly shut down and disarm the Berdyansk Cheka division.
So the Anarchist Intelligence Unit dismantles the Allied State Intelligence Unit. What does that tell us?
It reveals the inherent fragility of that alliance from the outset. For the Makhnovists, their counterintelligence wasn't just about external enemies. It was immediately focused on perceived threats from within the alliance itself, particularly from the Bolshevik state-building efforts and their secret police tactics, which were ideologically opposed to the Makhnovists' anti-state principles.
Makes sense.
This conflict, along with other pressures from the Red Army Command, ultimately led to Makhno resigning from the alliance, and this first Kontrrazvedka formation dissolved, with many agents retreating with Makhno's forces.
But this wasn't the end of it. Makhno reconstitutes the Kontrrazvedka later in 1919.
Yes, in July 1919, following a break with the Reds and facing renewed pressure, Makhno reorganized the Kontrrazvedka. He beasted around his personal security service, a 500 cavalry unit known as the Black Sotnia, which already had a reputation for punitive actions. This suggests the new Kontrrazvedka was perhaps even more directly tied to Makhno's personal authority and the army's need for internal security and discipline, sometimes through harsh means.
And their activities expanded beyond just operating in specific cities.
Absolutely. A significant action during this period, which the sources detail, was their investigation into Nikiforov. He was a former ally whose forces were accused of conducting pogroms and collaborating with the white movement. The Kontrrazvedka investigated these charges, found him guilty, and he was executed in July 1919.
So they're acting as internal police, too.
Very much so. Investigating allies, dispensing justice within the movement, it shows a powerful role.
They also continue to operate against the Red Army even after the alliance dissolved.
Yes. In August 1919, they managed to engineer a coup within the Red Army's 58th Rifle Division.
How did they manage that?
Well, this division contained former insurgent commanders who still had ties to the Makhno of China. The Kontrrazvedka's actions behind enemy lines facilitated a large number of defections, bringing experienced fighters and potentially intelligence back to the Makhnovist ranks.
Then, in September 1919, the Revolutionary Insurgent Army, the RIAU, is formally reorganized, and the Kontrrazvedka is officially reelected as part of that structure.
Right. This formalizes its position, generally subordinated to the Army's Operations Section and the Military Revolutionary Council, the VRS, which was the main executive body.
And the military Kontrrazvedka remained very active in this period.
It did. They were involved in leading raids against white trains and conducting bank robberies deep behind enemy lines, particularly in the Pryazovia region.
Right, the funding again.
Again, this highlights their dual function. Intelligence to find targets, and then directly carrying out the expropriations needed to fund the Army's operations when other supply lines were cut.
There's a complicated, brief agreement with the Ukrainian People's Republic, the UPA, around this time as well.
There was. In September 1919, the Makhnovist China and the UPA formed a temporary alliance. The sources revealed the Kontrrazvedka immediately began infiltrating the UPA ranks,
Of course they did.
gathering intelligence on their movements, their negotiations with the whites, and even reporting alleged plots against Makhno involving his own commanders like Fidyr Shus and figures close to him like Helena Kuzmenko.
And this intelligence led to a dramatic but ultimately failed attempt on the UPA leader's life.
Yes. Based on the intelligence gathered, the Kontrrazvedka plotted to assassinate the UPA leader, Simon Petliura, during a planned meeting in Uman.
But it failed.
The plot was thwarted, Petliura escaped, and the Kontrrazvedka agents involved were surrounded and killed after a brief battle. This event fundamentally shattered the fragile alliance between the two forces.
But remarkably, some Ukrainian nationalists from the UPA actually defected to the Makhnovists after this failed plot and the breakdown of the alliance.
They did. And interestingly, the sources note that the Kontrrazvedka then turned its attention to these defectors, continuing surveillance on their commanders and even executing some who were found to have committed pogroms during their time with the UPA.
Wow. So they're vetting defectors and enforcing their own code?
Exactly. It shows the Kontrrazvedka acting as both a vetting mechanism for new recruits and an enforcer of the Makhnovists' own, often harsh code.
And Kontrrazvedka's reach wasn't limited to Ukraine. Some agents were operating internationally or at least across former imperial territories.
That's right. Some agents who had been part of that first Kontrrazvedka formation joined Maria Nikiforova's separate anarchist terrorist detachment, attempting assassination missions against top white leaders like Denikin and Kolchak, far from the main Makhnovist front.
That's ambitious.
Very. Maxim Chordnyak, the first Kontrrazvedka chief, actually went on to lead his own insurgent movement in Siberia.
Really? In Siberia?
Yes. And agents K. Kovalevich and P. Sobolev traveled to Moscow, collaborating with left SRs in an attempt to assassinate prominent Russian Communist Party figures, with Sobolev even attempting to blow up the Kremlin.
These were incredibly high-stakes, ambitious operations.
Extremely. And by October 1919, they had been uncovered by the Cheka in Moscow. The agents were killed. Testimony from a captured anarchist reportedly linked the Moscow group's actions back to the Makhnovists in Ukraine, highlighting the perceived threat the Cheka saw from this network, extending far beyond Makhno's territory.
Following the major victory at the Battle of Perganovka in September 1919, a real high point for the Makhnovist China, the Kontrrazvedka seems to enter its most powerful phase, often considered its second main formation.
Yes, after Perganovka, the Makhnovists controlled a significant swath of territory across southern and eastern Ukraine. Their plan was to establish a free society with free Soviets in these areas.
And the Kontrrazvedka was central to this.
Absolutely. The sources give an example of their crucial role in recapturing cities like Berdyansk by recruiting local contacts, like fishermen, to help guide insurgents into the city covertly.
And their network structure expanded dramatically during this time.
It became very extensive. When the Makhnovist China controlled this large territory, the Kontrrazvedka established intelligence centers in virtually every major settlement.
Where did they operate from?
They deliberately set up shop in places where people congregated, like taverns and cafes, creating a vast network of informants and agents to gather intelligence on enemy movements, white and red conspiracies, and conditions in the rear.
Clever. But infiltrate an enemy lines must have been an incredibly dangerous job.
The sources note just how dangerous it was, so much so that it was sometimes assigned to delinquent insurgents as a form of punishment.
Punishment, really?
Yeah. If you were causing trouble or lacked discipline, you might be sent on a potentially suicidal mission as an infiltrator.
The civilian branch of the Kontrrazvedka, particularly under Dmitry Popov, seems to have wielded immense and controversial power in this period.
It did. The sources indicate that under Dmitry Popov, the civilian Kontrrazvedka operated with largely unchecked authority within the controlled territory. This led to the widespread use of cordon and search tactics and mass arrests of anyone deemed subversive.
And this is where the Kontrrazvedka's reputation becomes particularly brutal, described chillingly in the sources.
Yes. Reports from both red and white sources from this period paint a grim picture, describing the Kontrrazvedka under Popov as having a reputation for torture and arbitrary executions. The sources provide a truly chilling example from Katernizislav, describing executions carried out on the banks of the Dnieper River, with bodies simply left to be carried away by the current.
That's horrific.
It is. When white forces later re-entered Katerinoslav, they reportedly discovered the bodies of 70 individuals executed by the Kontrrazvedka. This era represents the darkest side of the agency, where the pressures of war and seemingly unchecked power led to methods that starkly contrasted with anarchist ideals.
One notable action they took during this powerful phase was uncovering a significant plot against the movement itself.
That was the Polonsky Conspiracy. It was a major Bolshevik plot aimed at assassinating the leading Makhnovist commanders and overthrowing the movement from within.
And the Kontrrazvedka stopped it.
They uncovered and suppressed this plot, which, from a security perspective, was a critical success. But it also highlights the intense level and internal threat they were constantly facing, and the lengths they went to eliminate it.
Beyond security and intelligence, the Kontrrazvedka continued to play a major economic role for the army.
They were deeply involved in requisitions and expropriations. While the army staff tried to manage requisitions in a more organized manner, the Kontrrazvedka was notorious for actions like looting the homes of executed white officers.
Right.
They also systematically expropriated property from banks and levied taxes or seizures from landlords and the bourgeoisie in cities under their control.
They even got a nickname related to this, didn't they?
They did. They were known as shubniks, which means fur coat wearers.
Shubniks.
Yeah, reportedly because they were so effective and perhaps zealous at requisitioning winter clothing for the troops sometimes, you could assume, keeping some themselves.
But you mentioned earlier there was also a surprising element to their economic activities.
Despite the looting and harsh methods, the sources also note that the Kontrrazvedka redistributed some of the expropriated wealth to the urban poor.
Really?
Yeah, thousands of people would apparently line up outside their headquarters in cities for portions of food or goods. They also transferred money to city orphanages.
So it's a complex picture.
Almost contradictory. An organization known for brutality and personal gain, also engaging in acts of social welfare, perhaps reflecting a blend of pragmatic survival, individual corruption, and lingering revolutionary ideals.
This unchecked power, particularly under Popov, sounds like a significant problem for an anarchist movement ideologically opposed to state authority and arbitrary power.
It was a major internal tension, and
Right.
sources don't shy away from it. Well, the Military Revolutionary Council, the VRS, was quite strict about discipline within the regular army, even executing looters from their own ranks to maintain order. They struggled significantly to control the Kontrrazvedka. The sources explicitly state that Kontrrazvedka agents often went entirely unpunished for looting, suggesting they operated with a degree of impunity the rest of the army didn't have.
Were there attempts from within the movement or the army to rein them in?
Yes, there were efforts. The Alexandrovsk Regional Congress in November 1919, which was a gathering of delegates from the controlled territory, established a commission specifically to investigate the Kontrrazvedka and address grievances.
And did it work?
Sources suggest these attempts at civilian control or external oversight were largely unsuccessful in curbing their power or methods.
But it wasn't completely unchecked, was it? There are instances where commanders pushed back against Makhno's or the Kontrrazvedka's more extreme impulses.
This is a really important nuance that challenges the idea of them being purely a brutal, monolithic entity.
Okay, like what?
Commanders like Alexander Kalashnikov and Seaman Karetnik actually prevented Makhno's unilateral orders for the execution of Menshevik and socialist revolutionary prisoners.
They refused Makhno's order.
Well, they argued against it. Viktor Bilash, the Army's chief of staff, specifically blocked Makhno's death order for the SRs, calling it motiveless terror that would backfire, and ordered the prisoners released.
Wow.
In another reported incident, when Makhno ordered the Kontrrazvedka to shut down a Bolshevik newspaper and shoot the staff, his own subordinates reportedly refused the order, declaring that freedom of the press would be upheld according to the movement's principles.
That's crucial.
It really is. These examples show that even within this system, there were individuals and structures that push back against arbitrary power and violence, highlighting an internal struggle to adhere to core anarchist ideals despite the brutal realities.
As 1920 began, the challenges facing the Makhno China escalated dramatically.
Absolutely. The army was ravaged by epidemic typhus, and they faced a renewed combined assault from both white and red forces, pushing them out of much of the territory they controlled.
The Kontrrazvedka still played a critical role in this desperate situation.
They did. With supply lines constantly disrupted,
Hmm.
the military kontrrazvedka became essential for covertly purchasing medicine and vital supplies in areas still held by the white cities like Crimea, Odessa, and Kharkiv, specifically to combat the devastating typhus outbreak.
Just getting medicine became an intelligence operation.
Essentially, yes.
And even when the main army was scattered after the Red Army reoccupied territory, the Kontrrazvedka's network somehow persisted underground.
This is key to their resilience. Figures like Lev Oleg and his staff continued operating covertly.
Hmm.
Even without a consolidated army, this underground network maintained communication links between disparate insurgent groups and, crucially, kept tracking Red Army movements.
Mm-hmm.
This intelligence was vital for the scattered insurgents to avoid open conflict they couldn't win and helped lay the foundation for the army to be reformed later that year.
Meanwhile, the Red Army and Cheka were actively hunting down anarchists across Ukraine.
They were. Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the Cheka, was given a specific mandate to liquidate the anarchist presence. The sources mention they even recruited criminals, promising them commuted death sentences, to infiltrate the Makhnovists and act as spies or assassins.
But the Kontrrazvedka was still effective enough to catch some of these spies.
Yes, in June 1920, the Kontrrazvedka managed to arrest and execute 2 Red spies who confessed under interrogation to planning Makhno's assassination. It shows that even in their weakened state, the network could still detect and neutralize threats.
Though their intelligence wasn't always perfect.
No. The sources recount a frustrating incident in June 1920 where the army suffered heavy losses and Makhno himself was wounded in a Red Army ambush.
Oh.
Makhno was reportedly furious with the Kontrrazvedka, even threatening Lev Zadov, because they hadn't provided a prior warning about the trap.
Understandable frustration, I guess.
It underscores the high expectations placed upon them and the severe consequences of failure.
This period also marks a significant organizational change. The formal abolition of parts of the Kontrrazvedka and the creation of a new body, the KD.
Yes. On July 9, 1920, the Revolutionary Insurgent Council, the RPS, which was the civilian military governing body, formally abolished the civilian section of the Kontrrazvedka.
Just the civilian section?
Yes. In a unanimous vote, they decided to transfer its judicial and punitive functions to a new entity, the Commission for Anti-Makhnovist Activities, or KA.
This sounds like a direct response to the criticisms raised earlier about the civilian Kontrrazvedka's conduct and unchecked power.
That's exactly what the sources imply. Figures like Viktor Bilash, Yakiv Sukovolsky, and Aaron Baron specifically criticized the Kontrrazvedka's abuses and pushed for the establishment of the KD, hoping to create a body with a clearer mandate and perhaps more oversight, though its subsequent actions were anything but restrained.
What was the KD's structure and, perhaps more importantly, its powers?
Nazar Zyuchenko was elected chairman, with members including prominent figures like Helena Kuzmenko and Hitory Vasilevsky.
Right.
The KD was given incredibly broad judicial power. It could prosecute prisoners of war from any side, white, red, UPA, as well as soldiers within the insurgent army.
And controversially.
Crucially and controversially, the sources state it was authorized to charge certain specific groups, Cheka agents, Bolshevik requisition units, and anti-Makhnovist partisans without investigation.
Without investigation.
That's what the sources say. It's sort of preemptive judgment based on affiliation.
And the KDD's actions become particularly stark during the escalating conflict with the Bolsheviks.
They do. Following the Cheka's execution of 2,000 Makhnovist prisoners in Chaplin, the Makhnovists carried out severe reprisals.
Right.
The KD oversaw what the sources describe as a purge of state officials in occupied areas. Under orders that included Helena Kuzmenko, Nestor Makhno, and Lev Zadov, an estimated 1,000 Bolshevik officials were executed during this period.
1,000, that's significant.
It highlights the KD's role in implementing the most brutal aspects of the counterterror.
They also handled other enemy groups.
Yes, the KAD disarmed a UPA unit found to be committing pogroms and executed its commander. When capturing white officers, the policy under the KA was to execute the officers but allow the rank-and-file soldiers to join the RIAU.
I see.
The sources added detail that in one instance involving captured white officers, they deliberately left the youngest member of the group alive, suggesting some arbitrary distinctions or perhaps grim mercy within their system.
As the focus shifted back to the fight against the whites, particularly General Wrangel's forces in the latter half of 1920, Kontrrazvedka K elements continued to be vital.
They were instrumental in the logistics of occupying cities to secure supplies and funding. The sources mention their role in seizing 22 million rubles from the Starobilsk Bank for army wages
Huge amount.
and targeting strategic resources like sugar refineries, as sugar had become a de facto currency.
Then there's the complex period following the Starobilsk Agreement, the temporary alliance with the Soviets against Wrangel. The KA took severe internal measures during this time.
This is another controversial moment. To avoid giving the Bolsheviks any pretexts to break the fragile agreement, the KAD ordered the execution of insurgent commanders who refused to cease hostilities against the Rebs,
Executing their own commander.
or who were caught recruiting Red Army deserters. It shows the KA enforcing political directives aimed at maintaining the alliance, even through lethal means against their own people.
That's intense.
It really was.
The military Kontrrazvedka also operated effectively behind white lines during the anti-Wrangel campaign.
This was a crucial intelligence success. They managed to direct white Makhnovist insurgents who had previously defected and joined the white forces to cease hostilities against the Red Army and prepare for the main Makhnovist advance.
So they sabotaged the whites from within.
Significantly.
Yeah.
These actions sabotaged white efforts and provided invaluable intelligence, allowing the main insurgent army to break through white lines and even reunite with some of those white Makhnovist units, strengthening the army for the final push.
And Kontrrazvedka chiefs themselves were directly involved in the final operation against Wrangel in Crimea.
Yes, Lev Zadov and Lev Golik, heading the military Kontrrazvedka units, joined Seaman Karatnik's detachment advancing towards Crimea.
Okay.
They utilized intelligence from their agents already operating inside Crimea to assist the Soviet forces in the crucial Perekop-Chonhar operation, helping identify routes and weaknesses that aided the Red Army in forcing the Saivash Lagoon and ultimately capturing the peninsula.
Even while allied against Wrangel, the tension with the Cheka never went away.
Not at all. The mistrust remained high. The sources note that in November 1920, the KAD, anticipating a larger Bolshevik attack despite the alliance, proactively arrested and executed infiltrated Cheka agents within their ranks.
Which proved tragically accurate because the Red Army launched a massive, decisive attack on the Makhnovist China almost immediately after the victory over Wrangel in late November 1920.
That overwhelming assault forced the insurgent army to scatter into smaller, disconnected detachments. But this is where the resilience of the Kontrrazvedka's network, particularly its grassroots elements, becomes incredibly important.
How did it become vital in that scattered underground phase?
That widespread network, especially the connections with the local peasant population, became the lifeline. It was crucial for communication between isolated insurgent groups, vital for reconnaissance gathering intelligence on Red Army positions, troop numbers, morale, the competency of commanders.
All essential intel.
Necessary for securing provisions in hostile territory, and even used for spreading disinformation to mislead Red Army patrols.
And Kontrrazvedka agents continued to operate, even infiltrating Bolshevik units.
Yes. The sources indicate they infiltrated Red Army units, which sometimes led to purges of Red Army officers suspected of Makhnovist sympathies. They also played a role in directing specific attacks by the scattered insurgent detachments, like the destruction of the Red Kyrgyz Brigade.
The armed resistance continued for nearly another year.
It did, until August 1921. Lev Zadov led the final retreat of the core Makhnovist group across the border into Romania, famously using intelligence and disguise, dressing his detachment in captured Red Army uniforms to make their escape.
But the legacy of this network, the Kontrrazvedka, persisted even after the main army was defeated.
That grassroots network of agents, covert organizations, small partisan units, hidden supply points continued operating underground. The sources suggest this network was instrumental in sustaining a low-level Makhnovist insurgency until the mid-1920s.
Wow, that long.
And more remarkably, it maintained cells in major cities like Huliaipol, Dnipro, Odessa, and Mariupol, acting as dormant contacts right up until they were finally rooted out during the Great Purge in 1938.
And Lev Zadov's personal story comes full circle, tragically linked to this network he helped build.
It's a really dark and complex end to his story. After returning to Ukraine years later, he actually became an operative for the OGPU, a successor to the Cheka.
Working for the Soviets.
Yes. He reportedly used his old Makhnovist network, perhaps initially to help exiled comrades, but tragically, during the 1938 purge, this very network was exposed, leading to the arrest and execution of 90 exiled Makhnovists in Odessa.
So the network he built destroyed them in the end.
A network built for survival ultimately led to their destruction. It's incredibly tragic.
Let's just quickly recap the structure and sheer scale of the Kontrrazvedka.
Sure. From an organizational standpoint, it was primarily subordinated to the Army's Operations Section and the Military Revolutionary Council.
Mm.
It evolved from a more centralized body into a decentralized network as the Makhnovist China grew, with its own units within each of the 4 Army Corps, independently reporting back to headquarters.
And the scale is quite surprising.
It is. The sources estimate that as many as 1/10 of all insurgents actively served as agents of the Kontrasvedka in some capacity,
1 in 10.
creating an incredibly dense and pervasive intelligence network throughout the Army and controlled territory.
Divided into military and civilian sections.
Yes, with distinct but overlapping roles. The military section focused heavily on intelligence gathering and reconnaissance behind enemy lines, identifying targets and tracking enemy movements, as well as hunting white collaborators.
Right.
The civilian section was primarily responsible for counterintelligence within Makhnovist territory, rooting out enemy spies, anti-Makhnovist partisans, and subversive persons, relying heavily on a network of civilian informants alongside their own agents.
And punishments, particularly the Black Terror sentences, had some form of review.
The sources indicate that sentences resulting from the Kontrasvedka's work, particularly death sentences, sometimes referred to as Black Terror sentences, were supposed to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
This review could be conducted by various bodies, depending on the period and location, including the Nabat, the Anarchist Confederation, the Hulige Pole Anarchist Union, or, most formally, by the Military Revolutionary Council, which was also responsible for overall Army discipline and military tribunals for serious offenses. Again, this points to an attempt at some level of internal check, even if, as we discussed with Popov's era, it wasn't always effective.
So, looking back at this whole history, what's the takeaway about the Makhnovist Kontrasvedka? It was clearly much more than just a couple of spies.
Absolutely. It was a complex, evolving, and absolutely critical organ for the Makhnovist China's survival. It handled intelligence, security, internal policing, logistics, funding through expropriation, and maintaining connections during periods of dispersal.
Yeah.
It operated in an incredibly brutal environment, and its methods reflected that.
And it constantly highlights that central paradox we started with. How does an anarchist movement, fundamentally opposed to state power, hierarchy, and coercion, create and rely upon a powerful, often brutal, secret police and intelligence agency with such significant, sometimes unchecked authority?
This deep dive into the Kontrasvedka forces you to grapple with the harsh realities of revolution and civil war. It shows the compromises movements make when survival is on the line, the messy, complex nature of intelligence and control in a conflict zone, and how even an organization built on ideals of freedom felt compelled to develop an apparatus of surveillance, expropriation, and repression to stand a chance against powerful, centralized enemies.
Yeah.
It wasn't a typical army, and its intelligence service was equally unconventional, impactful, and ultimately a reflection of the brutal world it inhabited.
Consider the fundamental tension inherent in an anti-state movement resorting to secret police tactics and seemingly unchecked power to survive. Was the Kontrasvedka a necessary evil for the Makhnovist China in its desperate fight against overwhelming state enemies? Or did its methods and the power it accumulated ultimately betray the very anarchist ideals the movement claimed to embody?